They told me to sit down and shut up at my own husband's estate dinner. Said I was just the widow, like I hadn't built every piece of this family from scratch. I smiled, stood up, and left without a word. They laughed when the door closed behind me. But by the time the sun came up, their accounts were frozen, their homes were locked, and everything they thought was theirs was legally mine, and I wasn't done yet. Before we start, please make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this, and also comment where you're watching from. Thanks. My name is Victoria Sterling. I'm 69 years old, and apparently, to my own family, that means I'm just the widow now. I ironed my silk blouse twice before leaving, checked my red lipstick 3 times in the hallway mirror, and told myself not to cry no matter what happened. It was just dinner, just my family, just the people I'd loved and raised for over 4 decades. We were meeting at my son Mason's house, the sprawling glass mansion he and Madison bought after William and I co-signed the mortgage. Not that anyone ever mentioned that anymore. They said we were gathering to discuss estate matters, which I assumed meant the house, the lakefront property, and the retirement accounts. All things William and I had built from absolute nothing while eating ramen noodles for dinner and skipping vacations for 22 years straight. I brought a fresh apple pie because William always said it was my specialty, and I thought maybe it would soften whatever storm was coming. When I walked through their marble foyer, no one even looked up. Mason was already pouring wine like some sommelier at an exclusive tasting, and Madison, in her designer heels and that perfectly practiced smile, was clicking around their chef's kitchen like she owned the entire world. Their oldest, Carter, gave me a barely perceptible nod, the kind you give a stranger at a funeral. The air was thick with tension and something burning in their professional-grade oven. We sat down at the dining table I'd bought them last Christmas, 9 of us around, that massive piece of reclaimed oak. Mason opened with his rehearsed line. "We've been thinking it's best if we simplify things moving forward," and I knew exactly what that meant. Less of me, more of them. When I asked, gently, carefully, "Have you spoken to our lawyer about the trust arrangements?" Madison didn't even glance up from her phone. She just muttered with cold dismissal, "You're just the widow, Victoria. Maybe just stay quiet for now." The room went dead silent. Then Mason actually chuckled, and so did Hunter, my other son, like this was some sitcom punchline they'd rehearsed. My hands trembled under the table, not because I was weak, but because the weight of that moment hit like a second death, except this time I was the one being buried alive. I looked at each of them one by one. Their eyes were glazed over like I was a placeholder, not a person, not the woman who had sacrificed everything to build their comfortable lives. I set my silver fork down, stood up slowly, and said absolutely nothing I didn't want to give them. The satisfaction of seeing my tears or hearing desperate speeches. I left the pie untouched on their granite countertop, walked to my car, locked the door, and for the first time in 43 years of marriage, I let the silence feel like peace instead of loneliness. They didn't even call after me, and they had absolutely no idea what I was about to unleash. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute. I just sat in William's old leather recliner, wrapped in the same cashmere throw we used to fight over during cold winter nights, the one with frayed edges and a faint coffee stain he never noticed. The room felt like it was holding its breath, and I kept playing their words over and over in my head like a broken record. "You're just the widow. Maybe just stay quiet," like I was some extra in my own family's story. Around 2:30 in the morning, I stood up because I couldn't bear the stillness anymore. I walked barefoot across the hardwood hallway to the antique cabinet we never let the boys touch when they were young. We used to call it the fortress, where we kept passports, property deeds, insurance policies, tax documents, and things they had no business knowing about. My hands were ice cold when I pulled open that heavy drawer. I had no clear idea what I was looking for. Maybe just a reminder that I still had some place in this family, that William hadn't left me completely defenseless against their greed. I pushed aside familiar papers, insurance documents, birth certificates, an old photograph of us in Colorado during our honeymoon, and that's when I saw it. A thick manila envelope wedged in the very back, labeled in William's distinctive handwriting with one word, Victoria. I stared at it like it might vanish into thin air. William wasn't the sentimental type who left love letters. He showed affection by making sure the car was serviced and the gutters were clean, not through romantic gestures. I opened it slowly, my hands already shaking, and inside was a single page of his notebook paper with a stack of official documents clipped behind it. The letter said, "If you're reading this, something has already gone terribly wrong. I wanted to tell you sooner, but I knew if I did, you'd try to fix everyone instead of protecting yourself. The boys, they're not evil, but they're selfish to their core. And Madison? She's worse than both of them combined. I saw it happening the moment I got my diagnosis. I made some critical changes. Everything is in your name now. The house, all accounts, the lakefront property. You have complete authority, full power of attorney. They don't know any of this yet. Don't feel guilty for using it. Don't let them shame you into silence ever again. And if they try to take what's rightfully yours, burn it all to the ground. I mean that, Victoria." I sat, there completely frozen, the magnitude of it sinking in like lead in my chest. I had no idea he'd done this. We talked in general terms about the will, but I thought he was just being his usual cautious self. I looked through the documents, official, notarized, sealed with our lawyer Rick's stamp. Everything legal and absolutely binding. There were complex terms outlined that I barely understood initially. Financial control clauses, ownership restructuring, complete transfer of assets, effective immediately upon death. It was all there, documented and ironclad. William had rewritten everything 8 months before he passed, during a time I thought we were just going to endless doctor appointments and trying experimental treatments. He had done it quietly, with total clarity, probably after seeing Mason sniffing around his business records and Madison asking those pointed questions about next steps with that fake sweet smile. I could practically hear William's voice telling me to stay sharp, to stop underestimating my own power and intelligence. I made chamomile tea just to keep my hands busy, though I never touched it. I paced our kitchen for what felt like hours, pulled the documents back out, and triple-checked every signature and date. It was real, all of it. And the more I studied it, the more I felt something fundamental shift inside me. That suffocating feeling of being invisible, like I was just a passenger in someone else's legacy, was replaced with something else entirely. Control. Pure, undiluted control. At 3:47 a.m., I picked up our landline and called Rick Thompson, our attorney for over 30 years, the one who used to slip William fishing magazines during boring meetings and always called me Mrs. Sterling, even after I told him it wasn't necessary. He answered after 4 rings, groggy but instantly, alert once I said my name. I didn't waste precious time on pleasantries. I said, "William left everything to me. I found all the paperwork. I want to activate it today." He paused for exactly 2 seconds, then asked if anyone else knew about this. Yet I told him no, not yet. "Good," he said firmly. "Don't tell them anything. I'll be there by 9 with everything you need to make this official." I hung up and stood in our hallway, staring at the old wedding photograph on the wall. Us on the courthouse steps, young and terrified but completely united. I touched the silver frame gently and whispered, "I've got this handled now, William. You don't have to worry anymore." Then I sat back down, folded the documents into a clean manila folder, and placed it in my purse like it was a loaded weapon. because that's exactly what it was. By the time Rick rang my doorbell at exactly 8:57 a.m., I was already fully dressed, makeup perfect, hair pinned back the way William always loved it, with all the documents spread across my dining table like a battle, strategy, and a legal pad filled with questions I'd written during my sleepless night. He stepped inside with his worn leather briefcase and that same battered folder he'd been carrying since the boys were in elementary school. When he saw the envelope William had left me, his expression shifted from professional concern to something closer to grim respect mixed with admiration. We spent 2 intensive hours going through every single clause, every legal term, every trigger, point, and contingency. By 11:15, I had signed 6 separate documents that transferred complete control of every asset, property, account, and business interest directly under my name. Rick made the final call to the estate manager, giving them verbal confirmation that all future instructions should come exclusively from me, not Mason, not Hunter, not even the trust board, just me. It felt surreal hearing him say it out, loud with such authority. All further authorization rests solely with Mrs. Victoria Sterling. I don't think I breathed for a full minute after that. Then he looked at me directly and asked, "Do you want them to discover this through their bank accounts, or do you want to call a family meeting?" I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds, then told him, "Let them feel it first. Let it hit like a freight train." He smiled for the first time that morning. Good. That's the Victoria I remember from 30 years ago. And just like that, it was finished. I spent the entire afternoon on the phone with William's investment manager, the property management firm, the title company, and our accountant, each one confirming that yes, my name was now the only name that mattered on every single document. By 3 p.m., I got a text from Mason. "Hey, weird question, but do you know why the cabin account is showing as locked?" I didn't respond. 5 minutes. Later, Madison called. I let it go straight to voicemail. Her tone was sharp and artificially sweet, the way it always got when she was preparing to manipulate something out of someone. By 4:30, their family group chat was lighting up with increasingly frantic messages about unexpected account issues and access problems. And Hunter, who rarely communicated about anything substantial, finally sent, "Did someone change the authorization on Mom's end?" That's when I knew the panic had officially started. They hadn't even begun to comprehend what I'd actually done yet, but the first tremor had hit, and the aftershocks were building. I waited until exactly 5:05, just as I knew they'd all be, gathered back at Mason's for another strategy session, and I walked up their stone pathway with my folder in hand, knocking on their door like I was simply dropping off a casserole for neighbors. Mason opened it, confused, irritated, that fake smile barely holding together. I walked past him into their foyer, set the folder on their kitchen island, and said, calmly, "You all might want to sit down for this." They didn't sit. Of course they didn't. Madison leaned against their marble countertop with her arms crossed defensively, and Hunter lingered in the hallway like he might need to make a quick escape. I opened the folder methodically, laid out each document, and said with perfect clarity, "This is the new estate arrangement. Everything is under my name. Everything." There was silence. Not the shocked kind, but the arrogant kind. The kind that thinks it's about to outsmart you with legal technicalities. Mason actually snorted and said, "You can't just move assets around without the trust board's approval." I looked him dead in the eyes and said, "There is no trust board anymore. William dissolved it last year. You clearly didn't read the fine print." Madison stepped forward, trying to scan the papers with her manicured nails and practiced smile, and said, "There's absolutely no way this is legally binding." That's when I handed her the final document, the notarized copy with Rick's signature and official date stamp. She froze completely. I took one deliberate step back and said, "This isn't a negotiation. This is a notification. As of this morning, you have zero legal claim to any of it." No one moved. No one spoke. It was the first time in years that room had been completely quiet while I stood in it. I turned toward their door, paused, and added, "The next time you want to discuss my future, you'll need to make an appointment." I didn't slam their door, didn't make dramatic speeches, didn't cry. I simply walked away and left them standing in the house William and I had paid for, choking on the control they thought they owned. The next morning, I was making coffee in my kitchen, the old drip machine sputtering like it always does when it's almost finished, and I could already feel the tension building before I even checked my phone. 5 missed calls from Mason, 3 from Madison and 1 from Hunter, who predictably had waited until the storm started before showing his face. I ignored them all and sat peacefully at my table with my favorite mug, watching steam rise and wondering if they'd managed even a single hour of sleep. Part of me hoped they hadn't. Around 9:12 a.m., Mason finally sent a text that was less aggressive and more desperate. "Can we please just talk?" That told me everything I needed to know. They were unraveling. By noon, Rick called to inform me that Mason had attempted to access 2 different accounts from his business laptop, and both attempts were immediately flagged by the security system. I told Rick, "Perfect. Let him keep digging." An hour later, Madison showed up at my front door uninvited, wearing oversized designer sunglasses like I wouldn't recognize her through tinted plastic and cosmetic surgery. I didn't invite her in. She stood on my porch like she was delivering devastating news to a neighbor she despised. "Victoria, we're all extremely confused here." She started with that tight smile and that voice she always used when pretending not to be absolutely furious. "Why would William do something like this behind everyone's back?" I looked her straight in the eyes and said, "Maybe because he knew exactly what you'd do if he hadn't." She flinched, like I'd physically slapped her. I added, "You should leave now. This is trespassing." She tried to throw out some vague threat about lawyers and legal challenges, but I closed the door before she could finish her sentence. 10 minutes later, Hunter called, his voice low like he didn't want his wife overhearing him. "Mom, I honestly didn't know about any of this. I thought the trust was just automatic. I didn't even realize Madison and Mason were pushing for control." I could hear the guilt in his voice, or maybe just the terror of being financially cut off. Said, "You had every opportunity to ask me directly, Hunter. You chose not to. That silence is your signature on this mess." He didn't respond, just hung up. That night, I cooked myself dinner for 1. Roasted chicken with herbs, garlic mashed potatoes, green beans with lemon, because I was finished, eating scraps while others feasted off my sacrifices. As I was pouring myself a glass of good wine, the landline rang again. This time it was Harper, Mason, and Madison's 18-year-old daughter, the only one who ever looked me directly in the eye during family dinners. Her voice was quiet, almost shaking. "Grandma, I don't understand what's happening, but Mom and Dad are completely freaking out. They said something about money being gone and the house being in trouble. Are you okay?" That hit me harder than anything else that day. I softened immediately. "I'm perfectly fine, sweetheart." "You didn't do anything wrong." She hesitated, then whispered, "I miss Grandpa so much. He would have hated all this fighting." I swallowed hard and told her the absolute truth. That's exactly why he fixed it before it could break us apart. After we hung up, I sat alone at my table, surrounded by peaceful quiet, and I felt something I hadn't experienced since William's funeral. Not grief, not rage, but complete clarity. William had seen this disaster coming from miles away, and now they were all flailing without their safety net. Mason had lost access to accounts he'd assumed were his inheritance. Madison had no legal claim to the house she bragged about to her yoga friends. Hunter was just now realizing that staying silent didn't mean staying innocent, and Harper, the only one with any genuine heart left in that family, was caught in the middle of their greed. I knew this was only the beginning. People like them don't surrender easily. They scramble, they twist facts, they look for loopholes and weaknesses. But what they didn't understand yet was that I wasn't some grieving old woman waiting for their approval. I was the firewall now. And if they wanted to challenge me, they'd better come prepared for the next devastating blow. 2 days after I shut the door on Madison and sent my message without saying a word, Rick called again. This time his tone made me sit down before he even started talking. "There's something critical you need to see," he said gravely. An hour later, I was sitting across from him in his office, the same place William and I used to meet every April to sign papers and drink. Terrible coffee from chipped mugs. He slid a thick folder across his desk without explanation. When I opened it, I didn't understand at first. Just bank statements, account transfers, loan agreements, all with Mason's name on them. "He used your husband's business line of credit as collateral," Rick said finally. $500,000, maybe more, depending on what we're still uncovering. He signed off on them as a business partner, but that partnership was legally dissolved when William passed, which means these transactions were completely fraudulent. My hands went numb. I flipped through the papers again, slower this time, watching as dates and figures started aligning like puzzle pieces. The new Range Rover Mason bought last year, the sudden kitchen renovation, the ski trip to Aspen they claimed was sponsored by friends. It was all funded by money that wasn't his. Money Mason had absolutely no legal right to touch. He did this. While William was still sick? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Rick nodded grimly. "We believe so. The first transaction processed 2 weeks after William's initial surgery. I stared at those numbers until they stopped looking like numbers and started looking like pure betrayal, the kind that rots everything from the inside out." Rick leaned forward and said, "We can press criminal charges if you want, or we can let the financial pressure build and watch him crumble. Your choice entirely." I didn't respond immediately. I needed time to process this completely. I drove home in total silence, went straight to William's study, still mostly untouched, and pulled out the leather journal he kept hidden behind the encyclopedias. That's where he scribbled notes during tax season and business reviews. Sure enough, on one of the final pages, in his neat handwriting, was a list titled "Things to Double Check." At the top, "Mason's withdrawals look suspicious. Ask Rick immediately." He must have known. He must have suspected the theft and never got the chance to finish investigating, and now it was my responsibility to complete what he couldn't. That night, I didn't sleep again. I sat at my kitchen table with the documents spread out like evidence, staring at proof that my own son, my flesh and blood, had been stealing from us while we were drowning in medical appointments and chemotherapy side effects. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I just made another folder, labeled it Consequences, and started making detailed notes. What assets could I liquidate? What debts could I call in? What investments could I freeze that Mason might still be attached to? The next morning, I called Rick and told him, "Don't press charges yet. Let him panic. I want him financially destroyed before he's legally scared." That same day, I called our estate accountant, Peter, whom I hadn't seen since William's retirement party. I asked him point blank, "Did you know about any of this theft?" He didn't try to deny it. "I had serious concerns, but your name wasn't on anything until now." My hands were completely tied. I told him, "Well, now they're not. Start talking." And he did for over an hour. He told me about suspicious fund movements, red flags he couldn't investigate without proper authorization, and how Mason had likely been building massive debt under the arrogant assumption that when William died, he'd inherit everything and could clean it all up afterward. It wasn't just greed driving him. It was pure arrogance. He never once considered that I'd be the one holding the pin when everything settled. That night, I sent Mason a single message. You might want to hire a lawyer, an accountant, and start looking for a very cheap apartment. I didn't get a reply, but I didn't need one. The only thing louder than his silence was the sound of everything he thought belonged to him slipping straight through his fingers. 3 days later, they invited me to their annual family barbecue, like absolutely nothing had happened. Like we hadn't turned the family structure upside down and shaken all the rotten pieces to the ground. While every instinct told me to stay home and let them eat their lies in peace, I showed up anyway. Sometimes silence isn't power. Sometimes showing your face is. I wore the pearl earrings William gave me for our 30th anniversary and brought a bottle of wine I knew none of them could afford anymore. When I walked into their backyard, the whole scene looked completely staged. Plastic tablecloths, forced smiles, music just loud enough to avoid real conversation. Madison was wearing white like she was trying to prove her innocence, and Mason stood behind the grill pretending to be the provider, flipping burgers, like the world wasn't burning under his feet. Hunter nodded at me awkwardly, like he wasn't sure whether to be angry or relieved. I didn't wait long. I walked directly to their picnic table, dropped my consequences folder on it, and said, "We need to discuss this. Now." Madison rolled her eyes dramatically. Mason muttered something under his breath. Hunter reached for a beer like a child trying to avoid punishment. I opened the folder and methodically laid out the documents. The loan fraud, the forged partnership extensions, the unauthorized fund transfers, everything. "This is what Mason did while your father was dying," I said flatly, without raising my voice. "Because people don't remember what you say as much as they remember how calm you were when you said it." Mason barked out a nervous laugh and said, "This is absolutely ridiculous. That's not even—" But I cut him off. "It's not speculation. It's notarized, confirmed by 3 separate institutions, and the only reason you're not in jail right now is because I'm giving you one final chance to own up to it." Madison stepped forward, her voice shrill and shaky. "This is obviously a setup. He didn't steal anything. William would have told us if something was wrong." I turned to her slowly, maintaining eye contact, and said, "William did see it happening. He just didn't trust any of you to fix it." For the first time, she had absolutely nothing to say. Harper, who'd been sitting quietly by the fence, looked at me with wide eyes like she was finally seeing the cracks in everything she'd been told to believe her whole life. I turned back to Mason and said, "You'll start signing ownership transfers today. The vehicles, the cabin furnishings, the business inventory. You don't get to enjoy the pieces of what you tried to destroy." Mason clenched his jaw, chest heaving, and said, "You're going to burn down the entire family over some paperwork?" Leaned in slightly and said, "No. You did that when you stole from your father's deathbed." That silenced him completely. I turned toward their back gate and heard someone, probably Madison, mutter, "You're just bitter. That's all you are. A bitter old woman who can't let go." I stopped without turning around and said just loud, enough for everyone to hear, "No, I'm the woman who paid for this entire yard, and I just decided you're not welcome in it anymore." Then I walked through their gate and didn't look back once. When I got home, I poured myself a glass of that expensive wine and sat on my porch, watching the sun disappear behind the trees, wondering how it was possible to feel grief and power simultaneously. I wasn't happy, but I was free. And freedom, it turns out, tastes infinitely better than forced smiles and stolen money. The following Monday, I met with a real estate attorney, and provided him with the complete list of properties William and I still legally owned. The lake house Mason posted about on Instagram, the downtown condo Hunter had been secretly renting out for cash under the table, and even the SUV Madison drove Harper to school in, while calling it a gift from Mason's hard work, when in reality, the lease had William's signature and was now legally mine. I signed the sale orders one by one. No hesitation, no ceremony, just clean, cold signatures that felt like removing tumors from a family that had stopped functioning years ago. The lawyer asked if I wanted to notify them personally or let the paperwork speak for itself. I said, they didn't invite me into the room when they thought they were dividing the kingdom. I'm not giving them a stage now that it's collapsing. By Friday, Mason's business account had been drained of illegal equity. Madison's credit cards were declined at an upscale boutique in the city, and Hunter called me sounding breathless, asking if the building manager was serious about terminating his lease. Yes, I said simply, and the next person living there will pay rent like everyone else in the world. Madison predictably didn't go down quietly. She showed up again, this time red-faced and screaming on my front steps like a banshee in designer heels, demanding answers and threatening to expose me for elder abuse, even though I was standing there with better posture, better legal standing, and frankly, better skin, despite all her injectable treatments. I didn't open the door. I didn't speak. I just stood behind my window with the blinds slightly cracked and watched her completely unravel until she gave up and stormed off in defeat. The next morning, I had a locksmith change every lock at the lake house. The day after that, the Range Rover was repossessed from Mason's driveway during their weekend brunch, while neighbors watched from behind their hedges. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was doing it to reclaim what was rightfully mine, what William and I had built brick by brick, while the rest of them watched from the sidelines and waited for the inheritance buffet to open. Harper texted me that night. Dad is completely losing it. They're talking about moving in with Aunt Rebecca. Is this permanent? I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. Actions are permanent. So are consequences. She didn't respond, but I could see her typing and stopping repeatedly, like she wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. I understood completely. She was trapped between the people who raised her and the truth they never wanted her to see. That night, I slept better than I had in months. No nightmares, no tossing and turning, just deep, peaceful quiet that settled in my bones like serenity, finally breaking through the chaos. When I woke up, I had a new email from our financial advisor, confirming that every major asset had been reclaimed, liquidated, or reassigned under my sole control. The message ended with one sentence I couldn't. Stop rereading. You now hold 100% authority. And for the first time since William died, I actually believed it. I was halfway through my morning toast when the doorbell rang. Before I could reach the front window to look, I saw a white envelope slide under my door. No return address, just my name printed in shaky handwriting. At first I thought it might be from Harper, maybe something handwritten she didn't want to send digitally. But when I opened it, what fell out stopped me cold. A copy of a psychiatric evaluation recommendation form, unsigned but marked with aggressive red highlighter around the words capacity assessment recommended. I knew exactly what this was. I'd seen enough of William's legal documents over the years to recognize a setup when I saw one. Someone, and I didn't need to guess who, was attempting to file paperwork challenging my control of the estate, under the claim that I was mentally unfit to make financial decisions. I held that page between my fingers and didn't feel fear. Just cold, slow-burning insult, like they'd finally run out of courage and were resorting to pure cowardice. That afternoon, I drove to Rick's office and dropped the envelope on his desk without explanation. He glanced through it, eyebrows rising, slowly, and said, "They actually tried this route. That's incredibly bold. I nodded once and said, "Find out who ordered the evaluation, who attempted to write it, and who forged the access authorization." 2 days later, Rick called me back with a voice sharper than I'd ever heard from him. It was Madison. She approached, a notary who owed her a personal favor, and tried to backdate the filing. "We have email evidence." One of the assistants turned everything over voluntarily. Apparently, she didn't appreciate being asked to commit a felony on a Sunday morning. I said, "Press charges immediately," he said, "already in motion." That evening, a county sheriff's vehicle pulled into Mason's driveway while they were loading groceries into the back of a borrowed sedan. The neighbors emerged like spectators at a car accident. Madison screamed and sobbed like someone who'd rehearsed this performance 1,000 times. But it didn't stop the deputies from handcuffing her on the sidewalk and reading the charges: forgery, fraud, attempted abuse of the court system. Mason tried to intervene, but the deputy shut him down. Instantly, with a firm hand on his chest. I wasn't there to witness it, but Harper told me later. She spoke quietly, like she was ashamed to be related to them. "She tried to say it was all your fault," Harper whispered. But nobody believed her, not even Dad. I told Harper, "Some people don't break under pressure. They rot from the inside until there's nothing left but noise and desperation." She didn't say anything after that, but I could hear her breathing on the line. For once, it felt like maybe someone in that house was finally seeing through the lies. That night, I poured myself a drink, opened the old photo album William used to flip through when he missed the boys, and stared at their toddler faces. Not because I missed those days, but because I needed to remind myself that I had loved them once, deeply and completely. You don't do what I did out of hatred. You do it because you were the only one who remembered how much was sacrificed to build it all. And if protecting that legacy meant sending one of them to jail, so be it. Madison had gambled everything on the assumption that I'd fold, that I'd feel embarrassed or weak or too old to fight back effectively. She didn't realize I'd stopped being afraid the day they told me to sit quietly like a shadow in a room I had paid for. Now I was finished being polite. And this time, I was going to complete the job. The courthouse hearing for Madison's arraignment was swift and brutal, just like the damage she'd tried to cause. I didn't bother attending. Rick sent me a message afterward with 3 words that said everything. She took a plea. I didn't need details. I knew Madison would never risk a trial, not with digital evidence tied to her personal email and sworn statements from the notary's assistant, who gave a detailed deposition in exchange for immunity. The plea bargain meant no jail time, but a permanent criminal record and a fine large enough to devastate their remaining financial stability. Mason didn't speak to me at all after that. Not to defend her, not to threaten me. Just complete radio silence. The kind that tells you someone has finally realized the ground beneath them has completely disappeared. I spent the following week shifting focus, not out of revenge anymore, but necessity. There were taxes to file, property transfers to finalize, and most importantly, decisions to make about what this entire battle would mean now that the smoke had cleared. I wasn't going to hoard every asset like some dragon guarding treasure. That had never been the point. I just wanted what was mine and what William and I had built to be protected from corruption. So I called Peter, our estate accountant, and instructed him to transfer ownership of the smaller house outside town. The one with the wraparound porch and yellow shutters, William always said, reminded him of his grandmother's place, directly into Harper's name. She didn't ask for it. She didn't expect it. But she was the only person in that entire family who had never tried to manipulate me, never looked away when things got difficult, never treated me like an obstacle to overcome. She cried when I told her, not the performative kind, but soft and genuine, like it broke something loose inside her that she'd been holding too tightly. "I don't deserve this," she said through tears, and I told her, "You do. because you never pretended to be something you weren't. That same week, I began working with a nonprofit consultant to establish the William Sterling Second Chance Foundation, a grant program specifically for widowed women over 60 who'd been pushed aside, excluded from financial decisions, or left holding scraps after their husbands passed away. I didn't want plaques or ceremonies. I just wanted something that would last longer than pain and family drama. The first application arrived before our website even launched, a handwritten letter from a woman in Tennessee whose children had emptied her bank account the day after her husband's funeral. I approved her grant within 2 hours. One evening, while organizing paperwork, I found an old note William had scribbled on a dry cleaning receipt tucked between pages of his retirement binder. It said, "Make sure Victoria knows she accomplished everything." I just stood beside her. I didn't cry. I just folded it carefully and placed it in the top drawer of his desk, right next to the original will, the house keys, and finally, peace. By Friday, I had closed the last joint account connected to Mason's fraudulent LLC, donated the remaining business inventory to a local entrepreneurship program, and sent an official cease and desist order to the final law firm still foolish enough to take his calls. The reconstruction wasn't glamorous or satisfying, but it was entirely mine and William's, and no longer weighed down by the greedy ghosts of people who shared his DNA but none of his integrity. And for the first time in months, as I sat on my front porch sipping coffee while contractors replaced the rotting fence panels we'd postponed fixing for years, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was rebuilding from the ashes, and I was doing it on my own terms. It wasn't until I stood in front of that long, polished dining table again, the same one where they'd told me to sit quietly just weeks earlier, that I fully understood how far I'd traveled and how far they'd fallen, and not one part of me felt guilty about it. Mason had sent the invitation himself, though he'd worded it like a casual social gathering, some nonsense about reconnecting and resetting, like this was a technical glitch or family miscommunication we could patch. Over with barbecue and forced apologies. I didn't go to forgive anyone. I went because sometimes the people who try to erase you need to see you standing at full height, no longer asking permission to exist in your own life. Madison wasn't there. Part of her legal agreement with the state involved staying away from me for at least 6 months. Hunter hovered in the background like he wanted to say something meaningful, but didn't know how to begin. Harper sat beside me, hands folded calmly in her lap, watchful and steady, like she was finally learning how to be still in a room full of smoke and mirrors. Mason stood at the head of the table like it was still his house, still his legacy to control. But even he looked diminished now, thinner, drained, like he'd finally stopped believing his own story about being the victim. He started with some rehearsed speech about how families weather storms differently and how people process grief in various ways. But I wasn't interested in his carefully crafted script. I set down my water glass, looked at every single person in that room and said clearly, "This isn't a storm. It's consequences, and every one of you wrote them. You could hear a pin drop. No one reached for their drinks. No one fidgeted or checked their phones." Mason opened his mouth, maybe to defend himself or throw another excuse into the fire, but I cut him off with a raised hand and continued. "You told me I was just the widow, that I should sit quietly and stay out of the way. But I wasn't quiet when I built this family. I wasn't quiet when I kept it alive through every challenge. And I sure as hell won't be quiet now that I've taken back what was always mine." I paused long enough to let that sink in completely, then added, "This table, this room, this entire house, I own them legally, financially, and morally. You're guests here now. Remember that." I stood up without waiting for responses or rebuttals. As I walked toward their front door, I turned back one final time and said, "You don't have to like me anymore. You just have to understand that I'm finished making myself small so you can feel important." Then I left, not because I was angry, but because I was complete. Outside, the sky was sharp and crystal clear, the kind of light William used to say was perfect for starting new projects. As I got into my car, I didn't feel victorious or vindictive or even particularly proud. I felt settled. I had walked through the fire and emerged on the other side, and now I got to rebuild. Not because someone gave me permission, but because I had given it to myself, and that, more than any revenge or inheritance or family title, was the victory I never thought I'd achieve, but had absolutely earned. The sun was setting behind me as I drove home, and for the first time in over a year, I was driving towards something instead of away from it. I was driving toward the rest of my life, the life William and I had built together, and the life I would continue building in his honor. And nobody, not even family, would ever make me feel small in it again.